Hi, I'm Chris Brown, and this is the third module in a series on introducing axiomatic design, and part of a larger course on axiomatic design and manufacturing processes, which is taught here at WPI. I'm in the mechanical engineering department, and have been working on axiomatic design for most of my engineering career. Anyway, let's start off with Sue's axioms before we look at these examples. So these were covered in the last video as well. Axiom 1, also known as the independence axiom, says maintain the independence of the functional requirements. Axiom 2, known as the information axiom, says that we should minimize the information content of the design. And in the series of examples that we're going to look at now, we'll be focusing on Axiom 1, independence. So the question in the previous video is this a good design? All right, well, let's apply it here. So here we have a sink and faucets, a hot water valve and a cold water valve. So a place to wash your hands. Is this a good design? How can we tell? Well, first we need to know, what does the user want to wash their hands? In other words, what is the customer need? Now, keep in mind there may be other stakeholders or other customers. So some designs in washrooms are based on making sure that nobody leaves the water running. But this one is going to be designed on the basis of the person and the needs of the person washing their hands. So let's imagine that this is the customer. So Axiom 1, independence. What are the functional requirements? So if we go to wash our hands, the customer need would be to have enough water at the right temperature to get your hands clean. So then we can say, well, what would be the functional requirements attached to this? So FR1, let's suppose, deliver water at the desired temperature, and FR2 is deliver water at the desired rate. In other words, we get the right temperature and the right flow rate, so we're happy washing our hands. Now, I should say this example comes from Sue's first book, The Principles of Design. Sue's first book on axiomatic design, The Principles of Design. And it's kind of a classic in axiomatic design. So what are the design parameters then for a traditional bathroom sink? Well, a cold water valve and a hot water valve. So is this good? Does it comply with Axiom 1? And what we do lots of times to look at compliance with Axiom 1 is we make a matrix, as we have here. And so down the left side we have the functional requirements, one relating to temperature and the other relating to flow rate. And across the top we have the design parameters. And so we have a cold water valve and a hot water valve. Now, the question we ask then, does the cold water valve influence the temperature? Yes, certainly. When we turn the cold water valve, the temperature changes. Does it influence the flow rate? Yes. As we turn the cold water valve, the flow rate goes up or down depending upon which way we turn it. And the same thing for the hot water valve. So as we look at our design matrix, we put X's where we see an influence. So DP1 influences FR1 and FR2, and so does DP2. So this is what we call a fully coupled design. We have not maintained, or does not maintain, the independence of the functional requirements. So in order to get the temperature and flow rate that you want, you have what we might call a non-productive iteration to reach the desired solution. You make a guess, you stick your hands under, you see if you like the temperature. Oh no, it's too hot, we'll turn up the cold. We turn up the cold, the flow rate's too high, it just splashed all over me. Adjust them both down, and then so on. Now, if we're just washing our hands and just getting a little water on us, the non-productive iterations are not so important. And we probably can develop a very wide tolerance for flow rate and water temperature, especially if we're in a hurry. But if we're making things, if we're making critical components for something, and we have this trouble adjusting, then these non-productive iterations can in fact be quite expensive and take up valuable manufacturing time. So it's important to pay attention to these. Let's take a look at another Axiom 1 example. Now this one is about a breakthrough design or design solution. It comes from naval warfare in March of 1862 during the American Civil War, the Monitor and the Virginia. Now sometimes it's called the Monitor and the Merrimack, and I often wondered why the South would have named one of their ships after a river in New Hampshire. And it turns out the Merrimack was sunk and the South raised it and rechristened it the Virginia. So just a small historical note. As I said, it comes from the American Civil War. And at that time there was already a kind of application of Axiom 1. Steam power was coming into ships, and locomotion then, for some ships anyway, was independent from the wind. So this is a kind of decoupling to be able to move so where and when you wanted to without worrying about the wind. So here's a depiction of the battle. Now the day before the battle, the Virginia entered into, or this is the day before the Monitor gets there. So this is March 8th. The Virginia is completed. It's an ironclad with many guns, as we can see there on the left side of this, and it goes out into Hampton Roads and essentially starts sinking Union ships at will. Now the Union knew that the South was working on something like this, and somebody named Erickson was up in New York designing and making the Monitor. Now the Monitor, it was a smaller ship, but it had a new FR, and that adjusts the direction of fire. And the new DP that goes with it was its swivel turret, very distinctive, as you can see on the top. Now on March 9th, the Monitor arrives in Hampton Roads, having its sea trials on its way down from New York. So with very little experience with the ship, it engages the CSS Virginia and neutralizes it. So the Virginia ends up running away up into a river and staying there essentially for the rest of the war. Now how was this smaller, slower ship able to neutralize the Virginia? Well, it had the extra FR. And you can see here in this depiction, the Monitor is located itself about 45 degrees off the bow or the stern, I'm not sure which, of the Virginia, and the Virginia doesn't have any guns pointing in that direction, and they can't individually aim their guns. But the Monitor can. And so the Monitor keeps positioning itself, even though it's slower than the Virginia, so that it can engage the Virginia without being engaged by the Virginia. This so frustrated the captain of the Virginia that he accused the captain of the Monitor of not being a gentleman. So, this is a kind of innovation by identifying coupling. The swivel turret essentially decouples the direction of travel and the direction of fire for the Monitor. So the new FR is adjust direction of fire. So this is part of maintaining the independence of the functional elements. Now you have to recognize, of course, that adjusting the direction of fire is something desirable. Now as we look for opportunities for innovation, would we be able to identify such an opportunity? Lots of times it comes out of frustration and with the way something is performing. And that's often the way sort of the coupling is manifested itself, is by frustrating us that we can't adjust something. So let's take a look. So the smaller, slower, outgunned essentially Monitor is able to defeat the Virginia because it has a new FR and a new DP. So the Virginia, here's the design matrix for the Virginia. Looking at the FRs down the left side, adjust direction of travel and adjust direction of fire. You do both with the rudder on the Virginia. So this is inherently a coupled design. One DP attempts to influence two FRs. So that the DP rudder is influencing both the direction of travel and the direction of fire. So this is what we call a coupled system. It lacks independence. Now if we take a look at the monitor, the idea was, well, let's add a turret so we can adjust the direction of fire independently. Now, one of the corollaries is that each FR requires its own DP. So if we take a look at the monitor's design matrix now, the rudder is able to adjust the direction of travel, and the turret is able to adjust the direction of fire. Now, here's a question. All right, so that O there in the spot in the matrix at the junction between DP2, the turret, and adjust the direction of travel, indicates that adjusting the turret has nothing to do with the direction of travel, and that these two things are independent. And that's what we're looking for in axiom 1. Now, are the rest of the O's in this matrix correct? Take a look for a moment. So let's take a look at DP1. It is there to adjust the direction of travel. Does it also adjust the direction of fire? Well, in fact, it does. So that if we were to do this matrix correctly, it is what we call a lower triangular matrix, as opposed to a diagonal matrix, which is what we have there. So there'll be more about this in a later module, but we're developing some of these concepts now so we can appreciate the power of axiomatic design, in this case, to explain something about what has happened in the past. We can be sure that Ericsson didn't know anything about axiomatic design, since the term doesn't come into the literature until the 1970s, nearly 100 years, or more than 100 years after the monitor made its way to Hampton Roads. So one of the corollaries in axiomatic design is that each FR requires a DP. In the case of the Virginia, had anybody recognized you'd want independent adjustment of the direction of fire, then they only had one DP, and they should have known that it needed to do something else because they didn't have another DP. It cannot be independent if you don't have a DP for each FR. All right, let's take a look at another example. And I claimed in an earlier video, an earlier module, that you could also use axiomatic design to design a vacation. So, what should the FRs be for a vacation? Well, let's suppose it's relaxation and romance. Let's not speculate either on what the customer needs are that these are fulfilling, but so we've got FR1 relaxation, FR2 romance. So let's say the initial design proposal is let's use ethanol to relax and let's use dancing for the romance. So that's what our design matrix looks like. DP's across the top, FR's down the side. So then, all right, so what the ethanol was selected for relaxation, so it influences the relaxation. Does ethanol have an influence on romance? Yes, and it can be quite negative if there is too much ethanol. It's hard to be attractive when you've had too much to drink. All right, so the ethanol is influencing both of these. Now the dancing, let's say for the moment, doesn't influence the relaxation, at least not in such a way that it'll take the relaxation out of the tolerance. So, but it's intended to influence the romance, so there's an interaction there. Alright, so we have a lower triangular matrix. Now, it's possible that with enough alcohol, no amount of dancing will compensate. So, the risk that this designed solution using ethanol will function as intended could be high. So what do you want to do? You would like then, well, let's see if we can find another DP that won't that'll provide relaxation without influencing the romance. What about yoga? Let's see what this would look like. So yoga is intended to influence the relaxation. Let's suppose that it does, and then yoga will not negatively influence the romance. So dancing still does not influence the relaxation, and does, is intended, influences the romance. Now, ethanol is not a good solution, even though it may be a good solvent, because it influences too many things. Yoga is more independent, so think flexibility, adaptability, sort of like yoga. Alright, here's another one, a thought kind of thing. Did coupling cause problems for the space shuttle? We lost 2 orbiters and lost the crews to 2. What were the functional requirements that the space shuttle was trying to fulfill? Carry people into orbit, carry cargo into orbit. Let's keep it simple for the moment and not think about what it was taking to convince Congress to vote for funds for this. But did anybody carefully consider what another way to fulfill these might have been? So we have one system carrying, or we had one system carrying both people and cargo into orbit. How could they have been satisfied independently? So I will leave that to you. But you want to do it in such a way that you maintain the independence of the functional elements. Alright, innovation, just in summary. We can recognize where ability to adjust a function immediately can increase value. This implies a new functional requirement and new physical elements. So maintaining the independence of the functional requirements, axiom 1, that's essential to that kind of innovation. Alright, so can you find a system or think of a system that suffers from unwanted coupling? And can you find an example of a system that suffers from too much information? Thank you very much for your attention.